Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. My name is Carlo Morante, and I'm one of the organizers for TEDxUCLA. We want to thank you for being here with us today and taking some time out of your day to join us in our second session of UCLA Conversations with TEDx Speakers. This is a new format that we're trying out this year as a result of the cancellation of our 2020 conference. So again, we're very grateful that you are hopping in this new adventure with us. To give you a little bit of an overview of what's going to happen today, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Alex, in a little bit. But before that, we're going to be able to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes with some questions that I have for Alex. And after that, two of my colleagues, which will introduce themselves in a little bit, we'll be able to gather information that you've all been sharing on the chat, any questions that may have come up for you during the time with Alex today. And then after those 15 to 20 minutes, it's going to be about the participants and the speakers. So it's going to be all up to you all to pose those questions that are really burning for you, and gives those over to Alex, and Josh and Scott will be able to take those questions over from the chat over to him. But I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. So Scott and Josh.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Our wonderful speaker right now is in Australia. So if you are outside of California in the United States, we would ask you to jump into the chat and tell us where you're at right now. But my name is Josh O'Connor. I'm one of the co-curators for TEDxUCLA, and we are so grateful to have all of you with us today. We are going to ask all of our speakers, all of our participants to actually not remain on camera while we do this, as we are recording, and we will do that reminder as we go through. And any questions that you have as you come up, do not be afraid to jump into our chat and throw in some questions. And thank you so much to Lindsay from Canada, and we've got Pedro from Brazil, and Kinsley from Australia, and Shauna from Ireland, and it keeps coming. Holy mackerel, from South Africa and Argentina and Washington, D.C. Thank you. This is a worldwide welcome and effort. We're so glad to have you here today. Scott.
And yeah, just to add, Josh and I will be monitoring the Zoom chat. This is really a conversation with Alex today. We want to hear your ideas. We want your paradigms to be challenged. We want you to think about how you might think about some of these things differently that he's going to be presenting today. So Josh and I will be grabbing the things that you're asking in the chat, and Alex will be participating in the conversation.
Great, thank you, Scott and Josh. And I know that last week people really utilized the chat tool for a place to share ideas, even personal stories. And so we definitely want to promote that behavior again this week. So please engage with that chat throughout the entire time today. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We're so excited to have Alex Braczkowski here with us today. As someone who's really passionate about the arts, storytelling, and animal conservation, it's really, really an exciting and unique opportunity for me to have you here, Alex. So could you please go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what you're going to share with us today?
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Carlo. Hey, everybody. I know that we're all on different time zones, so thanks to everybody for jumping in today, no matter where your time zone is. So my name is Alexander Braczkowski, and I'm a big cat biologist, but I'm also a wildlife cameraman and photographer. My focus has really been on big cats over the last 10 years, working on species like leopards, African lions, caracals, and even smaller species like serval. We've been very lucky to work on both National Geographic television and magazine assignments. And my real passion is science and the nexus between science and media communication. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, is the power of imagery and sort of how we can fuse those two elements and basically disseminate our work to the broader public worldwide.
Great. And I know that you have a couple of pictures and videos to share with us, Alex, so go ahead and if you want to go start screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Carlo. Yeah. Great. So I'm going to kind of run through these very quickly because I know that I want to get Josh and Carlo and the team to sort of facilitate the questions and the conversation. So I really got my break with African leopards I was actually incredibly fortunate because they lived around my university campus in the small town of George, South Africa. This was a photograph that was taken in 2012 with Tristan Dickerson, who was one of my mentors, and we were actually immobilizing and removing a satellite collar from one of our study animals just on the Mozambican border in a place called Pinda Private Game Reserve. In 2014, I got my break away from science, where I was really doing a lot of research on these big cats, and started working with this man, Steve Winter. He's probably National Geographic's foremost big cat photographer. He took his wing and photography, and we pretty much started traveling the world together. This is us in Sri Lanka. We were doing one of the biggest coverage stories of leopards ever done. We traveled to Mumbai, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and basically try to get images that no one had ever seen before of these cats in different environments. This is me trying to be very badly a leopard on a beach called Butwa in the Yala National Park in Sri Lanka. But where I really come in from is still having this value and strong sense of being a scientist. So I recently finished my PhD at the University of Queensland in Australia, and that was on the animal you see to the right of your screen, which is an African lion. I was working on a population of lions that actually climb trees in southwest Uganda, the Congo-Uganda border. And that to me there is on the right is me with some rangers in Chad, where we were also doing some work on wildlife and looking at lions in the ecosystem. I'm also quite actively involved in work examining the illegal wildlife trade. This is, again, working with Steve Winter on jaguars in South America. We were looking at the expose of how these body parts of these species are being traded in actually some of these wet markets that we've now found have been quite an important player in this big global pandemic that we're seeing. And I've always tried to sort of double up, if you will, the media side of things, either working as a cameraman or an assistant photographer, and then also trying to see if I can get some kind of study going on the ground. And I've been very lucky because the work that we did in India, for example, we published a paper where we actually looked at the health benefits of leopards, and we did a TV show on how they are living in one of the most populated urban zones in the world. We did the same thing with the jaguars. So there was a National Geographic magazine story, and there was a scientific study that emanated from that. Now,
and Alex, I know that you were first a biologist, right? And so what prompted this transition over to also filmmaking, right? And being able to tell these stories. What happened that made you want to tell the stories through film?
I think, Carlo, the most sort of blunt question, the answer to that is that I think we as humans are an incredibly visual species. You respond to visual stimuli, and I don't think anything quite gets across a message like a powerful image or video. And this slide over here really sort of emphasizes that. So this is an editorial that was published in Science magazine in 2017 by a senator called Christopher Kuhn. And he basically was really advocating for scientists being more vocal in the popular media and trying to sort of make their voices heard in the policy making and funding spheres. And there's one particular man that I always sort of refer to as Paul Nicklin. He's become this sort of enigma in the photography game because he actually at 26 years of age started out as a scientist, but quickly moved over to being a visual storyteller. And this is a photograph that he took with a partner in 2017, and this is actually one of the most viral posts that was ever shared on Facebook, on Instagram, on all of these social media platforms. And it was of a bear, this emaciated bear that was actually eating from a trash can. And it showed potentially the very strong link between how these bears are losing ice, the links to human-based carbon emissions, and basically sort of how these animals are faring in the wild. And I put this image up here because, as I said, it was one of the most viral images of the year and of that particular outlet. Now, where I think we as scientists often struggle, at least this has been my own personal struggle as a scientist, is the whole idea of taking whatever science, whatever results we have, and communicating that to the mainstream, getting that into the media outlets, getting that into newspapers, onto video, into the news. And, there's this famous saying from Casey Neistat that story is king and everything everything else is slave to the story. And, he has been really an anomaly over the last decade of using smartphone technology essentially to tell these incredibly engaging stories, and basically showing that you need very little technology to really bring across an amazing message. And that's a little bit what I'm going to be talking about today, is really focusing with my own work on lions in Uganda, showing that you don't need fancy equipment, you don't need big end cameras. What you need is a good story, and you need the totality of the story to really be able to get that message out there into the world. These are some images that I wanted to share. So with the work that I've done with Steve over the years, so these are his images, and if you notice a pattern, you'll see that these images, I mean, this is a captive jaguar, but this, for instance, over here, this is in Chiribiketi National Park in Colombia. And this is an ancient petroglyph by the ancient Mayans that were living in this area about 15,000 years ago. It's of a jaguar in this landscape. Same thing over here. You're not seeing any leopards in the frame. And you'll typically see that about 40 to 50% of any National Geographic magazine story actually only has about 50% images of wildlife. And that really shows the need to tell the story around your subject. And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today with my work with the tree climbing lions of Uganda. Carla, how are we doing? Do you want to stop me in here? Do we want to sort of jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I know that the work that you do is telling this holistic story, right? It's not just posting pictures of lions and jaguars, but it's telling the stories of where they live, the communities that they also interact with. So what has been challenging in doing that, especially in the context of species conservation?
I guess. So sort of from a storytelling perspective, it's really trying to identify and isolate the most engaging stories. And with the big cats, it's often trying to isolate where those points of conflict are between the cats and the people that live alongside, with lions, with leopards, with jaguars. The main one is actually sort of the conflict over what we eat. So the sheep, the cattle, the goats that we both as people and as big cats eat, there's a constant struggle, and people are killing jaguars are killing the stock. So that is sort of, for me, it's often identifying where those conflicts are, what the biggest threats are to those species, and how we best tell that in a visual way. That to me is one of the key ones.
And what is the connection between species conservation and also human life?
Well, I guess the biggest one for me is conservation outcomes are largely governed about how people are doing in and around these protected areas, or even non-protected areas where these animals are living. So it's actually your socio-economic factors that are really your driving force about how the animals do. Things like your Gini coefficient, so the essential way that your inequality is represented in the landscape, your index of corruption in your country, how good is your governing and your policy, basically how educated is the population at large, are your different groups of your society being represented, is there an education of women? Those are the things that really drive species conservation at large, and where those things are doing well, apart from the fact where the people actually have something in their belly to eat, those are the things that really drive conservation outcomes. It's not really just sticking rangers in a park, putting up some fences, putting some guns in their hands and being like, okay, we're going to keep everybody out. No, it's very much moving away from that.
Yeah, thank you for painting such a holistic picture of a complex topic, right? And so why is it so critical? Why is this such a critical issue today on species conservation?
I guess today, I mean, literally today, we are seeing the face of, the globe's first pandemic really in the last 100 years, something of real epic proportions to the point where, you know, we are all teetering on the verge of an economic collapse. And there is no better example of why this is important now. And the main reason for that is because we are seeing that when you have this nexus of people and wildlife, and if you cannot manage that properly, and if you cannot really find a way for that to coexist, these are the exact kind of results that are going to happen. And when I talk about the nexus of these pandemics, we have pretty good evidence to suggest that these influenzas, these coronaviruses, these viruses like Ebola, Henta, Marburg, all of these epidemics and what become pandemics are linked to sanitation in wet markets that have wildlife products, and also in the way that people are eating these wildlife. So for instance, in the big Ebola outbreaks that took place between 2014 to 2016 in Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, in that West African bloc of countries, we have pretty strong evidence in the scientific community that your species of fruit bats are a pretty strong reservoir for that disease. And there is transmission into that across bushmeat markets. And then there is actually a concomitant reverse back into wild populations. So there's this kind of mixing between bushmeat, people, the bushmeat, and then wild animal populations. And, you know, in remote parts of Africa, if you cannot really best monitor that, if you cannot help people sort of establish sort of certain levels of sanitation, you're going to see that these pandemics and epidemics are going to become complex.
Yeah. So you've talked about the connection between species conservation and human life, but what about the connection between the conservation of these big cats, these carnivores, in the context of ecology? How does that affect our natural landscape? How does that affect other species that are living in the same communities as these big cats?
Right. So I guess sort of to hone in on your question, the relative importance of why these carnivores are so important in these ecosystems. So, you know, I know that our audience is probably quite diverse in terms of what their backgrounds are, in terms of what they studied, but essentially we probably all remember from high school or even junior school biology that, you know, there was this what they called this trophic pyramid or this food pyramid. The idea comes from a popular book called Why Big Fierce Animals Are Rare by a guy called Paul Colin Byrne. He popularized this idea, but essentially is that there are these levels, and the first level is, you know, you have your primary producers, which are your grasses, your trees, your plants. Then you have your primary consumers, which are your things like your deer, your various antelope species. Then you have your secondary consumers, things like foxes and jackals. And then you, right at the tip, at that little apex, you get the large carnivores, things like wolves, mountain lions, leopards, lions. And there is this energy transfer. And basically, you know, those ones right at the top, there's not a lot of them, but they're incredibly important because they control and they exude these predatory pressures on the lower levels. So we know that, for instance, in Yellowstone, in parts of Yosemite National Park and Zion National Park, where you've lost wolves and mountain lions, you can actually see how the structure of the vegetation has changed, and you can mark that down to the exact moment when those animals disappeared, because then the deer populations increased, the number of young trees were pretty much completely taken out. So now all you have is literally adult trees, and you can actually see that at the ecosystem level. Mm-hmm. So, you know, once you lose your carnivores in an ecosystem, things pretty quickly deteriorate on multiple levels of that sort of energy pyramid.
Yeah, thank you. So we talked about how species conservation relates to the socioeconomic status and climate of countries. We talked about how it connects to human life and also different species living in the same communities as these big cats. And so I want to pass it on to Josh and Scott. What have the people over on the chat been saying?
Sorry, can I just add, sorry, that just so you know, we do still have, I think, about we still have about 20 quick slides. So just so you know that still is there.
We can cut back to them, but I'd like to ask a question that Beverly asked, and maybe the reverse of it too. She asks, you know, you're at the intersection of science and media. How does someone with a background in research take the first step into science-related media? And I would ask the exact opposite of that too. How does somebody in the media arts step in and be in that intersection of science? Usually these are very different parts of a university or very different disciplines. How did you find that intersection, and what are your ideas?
I was very lucky, Scott, in the sense that I had access to, you know, a really top tier photographer that took me under his wing. But many people obviously won't have that. But there is some good news. You know, National Geographic, for example, has a grant program, and that is probably the quickest and easiest streamlined way of getting from one discipline into the other, because they fund both research and they fund media communication. And that's the easiest way to kind of, you know, basically write a grant. And there's numerous granting agencies right now. You know, there's really so many out there. It really, in Google, you just search photography : grant or wildlife photography : grant. You know, but to answer the first part of the question, obviously, in order to get money from someone to help you fulfill your dream of becoming a good photographer or vice versa researcher, you really need to hone in on that thing, whatever that is, that story. And what I always tell people, it's not, say we are working on a story on monarch butterflies. It's really about telling the bigger story around butterflies. Yes, maybe there will be some incredible images of you getting images of these monarch butterflies, but really, where is the corridor, how those monarch butterflies move? What are the threats in that corridor? Who are the main human players, and how do you show those visually? So really, it's finding a good story subject, and then building in the characters around that. And if you look at like all of these social media platforms, when people talk about wildlife photography, 90% of the players are not doing that. It's all about the animal. And where all of these publications are going is we want the human, the environment, and the landscape story around that subject.
That's it's incredible, and the work that you're doing. I think you have potentially changed a portion of our attendees who now want to do the work that you're doing. And a lot of questions are coming in about how did you get involved in this, and how can we, the general public, get involved in this? We have a couple folks that are studying this to be animal biologists, like Shauna, who is in Europe right now and wants to work in conservation. And then we also have some folks that are just saying, listen, I actually don't work in the field, but how do I get involved in the conservation of animals?
Right. So there's a couple of key angles, and I guess it really depends on sort of how deep and how much time you want to commit. So the easiest way, obviously, in a very superficial way, superficial in the sense that you don't have to do much in terms of the action that you do, but basically, obviously, find a really good, reputable charity that does on the ground science or conservation, and donate to them. So if it's lions or jaguars or elephants, whatever it is, you know, simple Google search. You know, looking at the sort of, ideally non-governmental organizations that have some kind of accreditation are usually good to donate to. So I'd say that's one very simplistic way. Two, there is a really cool way if you want to do this sort of part-time, want to help. There's actually a lot of citizen science that one can get involved in if they're a non-scientist or non-biologist. For example, there's the Serengeti lion and biodiversity monitoring program, and they have thousands and thousands of images that are taken from these small remote trail camps that they actually need members of the public to look at, analyze, identify the images in there. So in that way, you are kind of giving up your time, and you're directly involved in the analysis and the assessment of data for scientific and conservation projects. And then the third one, you know, if you really want to get involved on at least the biology side of things, and you want to quit your day job, and there's some fantastic conservation and research programs in the fields of biology and conservation that are offered by a host of universities out there. You know, I think there's never been a better time to study this stuff, because you can do it so quickly. You can usually get a degree in about 3 years. Yeah.
So thank you, Alex. Beverly also asked, with regards to science communication, how are you able to gauge the impact of your work? We know that the work is amazing, but how do you find how do you gauge that? That's the question. How do you gauge the impact?
I think, sorry, so is that Shauna that asked that?
That was actually Beverly.
Beverly. Yeah. So that's an incredibly important question. And I think that this really cuts into the sort of heart of all of the stuff, right? And again, it sort of goes back to that polar bear image that I had in the presentation. And again, the most sort of viral image of that year on the Nat Geo platforms, all social media platforms. What does it do? I think is incredibly difficult to gauge. Again, it depends on what your response variable is. What does it do for what and for whom? So I think, for instance, to be honest with you, with science communication, there's very few empirical studies that have tried to really get at the heart of this problem. So basically, you shoot a documentary and you want to know what its impact is, but then you have to be very specific in terms of what that is. Is it the number of children that are educated at schools, in local schools, say in the western part of Uganda? Is it the amount of donations that are coming in? There is some limited evidence. There was one study recently done on in South Africa, actually in the Limpopo province, of basically some science presentations that were done to some school children prior and before, and sort of if their attitudes to predators changed. And there was some suggestion that that did in fact happen. But at the bigger scale, I think it's something that scientists need to look at in much more depth. Like, what are these big photographic and science stories, even at the real peak of outlets, whether it's Nat Geo, New York Times, whatever it is, what do they really, really do, and what do they achieve? And I don't really have the answer for that question because I don't know.
Alex, we have a follow-up to that question from May about, she's a biology major at Humboldt State. What classes should she be taking? And I think that also speaks to, universities usually have biology and the arts in very separate areas. Often these classes are impacted and it's very hard to move across. What are your ideas, and what would you like to see happen to allow more of this cross-pollination for a single person to have more impact?
Again, I think Scott and May, I think the now is the time more than ever, to really engage in just, we live in a time now where we can get photography equipment for so cheap, photography equipment that flies and that is stabilized. We can get a drone for like $300. We can get, all of our smartphones now have 4K video technology. You can get little stabilizers, for $200. So it's not even about taking classes if you're already a biology major. The fact that you're already a biology major is a step above a lot of people because they haven't got the sort of chance to learn about animals, right? So you're actually already, or plants or whatever you're doing. So you're already on the on-ramp to that. The visual side of things is more of a technical thing. It's something that you need practice for. It's something that you need to get your eye adjusted for. So I would say just, pick up photography magazines. I would say pick up a small 35 millimeter, digital camera. Try and figure out small stories that you can do around your university campus. If there's researchers that are already on your university campus that are working even remotely on or associated to an animal or a plant that you're interested in, go with them. And again, a good story doesn't have to be about that mountain lion running across a bridge in Los Angeles. It's got everything to do with everything around that mountain lion. So I want to know, who's tracking that mountain lion for science. When they immobilize and they put a satellite collar, that's an image, that's a video. So I think we're kind of a little bit blinded by the fact that we see these there's this hyper loading of video and imagery of wildlife on these social media platforms. but really photography stories, a lot of the time, as I say, 40 to 50% is images of the animals themselves. Everything else is around those animals. So just practice and watch a lot of YouTube videos. Yeah.
So there are so many more questions coming in, and we want to get to all of them. I also know that you have a few more, a little bit more on your story that you wanted to tell. Why don't we jump back to your slides for maybe 5 more minutes, and then we're going to to those stories up.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to power through these very quickly, just because might just be a little bit more interesting than my voice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the totality of, and I'm talking about in terms of visual story making. So this answers both Beverly and May's questions. So it's not really about your equipment. So this is my Jeep. That's a little door that my best friend Matt Myhill made for me. Yes, that's a good camera, and that's a tripod. But you can see that it's very rudimentary in terms of a setup for filming lions. For instance, you know, I think the last Dynasties series on television had a budget of £28 million. I think my whole budget for that film was $83,000, and it sounds like a lot of money, but it's not if you're spending nearly a year filming lions. So when I went into southwestern Uganda, and when I was filming and photographing these lions that climb these trees, I was more interested in figuring out ways where I could get closer to the cats, show them visually in a way that no one had done before. So I would use these small consumer drones that you can buy in any shop. You can buy them at, in your backyard there in the United States. And I would also stand and even climb into the trees with the lions. And that was much more important than getting super fancy high-tech equipment. It was about figuring out sort of visually how I can get into these weird places with the lions. And these are images. This is a little video I'm going to play. And what I could do is I could get super, super close to them. And this is the first time that anyone had actually tried to use small consumer level drones with big cats in these trees. This is actually me in the tree with the lions. This one over here. This one here again. I was on top of that vehicle in with the lions. Same so, here Alex, again.
What's something worth sharing that you were able to discover by getting so close to these animals using this footage that you're talking about?
I guess the thing that I can share is, you know, all trying angle, just a different visual way of showing a story. So, you know, if you're photographing a subject, try to photograph it from different angles. Try and use maybe a different filter, try and use a different angle lens if you have. But first and foremost, you know, try and make sure that you are telling a much wider and bigger story. So a lot of the times when I would do photography, for instance, in these images, so I was doing the science, I was collaring lions, but at the same time I was doubling up and taking photos of the team. This is Jimmy, Ludwig Schiefer. This is the team of guys that was working on these lions. And I was trying to tell this visual story of, well, there's also a conservation problem here. We're collaring lions. There was an even bigger problem. There was actually cows living inside the national park. So I shot up my drone again, try to show visually the problem of these cows living inside the national park. This is an interesting image, and I spent one day, and it's you can see the lion in this picture is actually a really old, badly stuffed mannequin. But basically it is the original skin of the lion that nearly killed this man, Isaac Koza. And the kind of idea behind this image was, you know, I wanted to show as part of this lion story that lions are living alongside people, and they are, you know, sometimes killing them, sometimes killing their children, sometimes killing their livestock. And for me, this is kind of an interesting image. There's something there. Going back to May and Beverly's questions, you know, I think one of the biggest challenges as a young graduate or even a postgraduate is, you know, like, well, I'm not working on lions. I'm not working on elephants. I'm not working on these species that are incredibly like amazing to look at visually and from a photographic perspective. But I've put these few images up here. These are taken by a man called Anand Varma. He's a Nat Geo photographer, and he did a story on hummingbirds in a laboratory, and he was kind of trying to look at how these animals are aerodynamic, the structure of their wings, and basically the reason I'm putting up these images because there are so many stories. I don't care if they come from a lab. I don't care if they come from a story about someone picking an incredibly rare and locally endemic flower species in the mountains outside of the university. There are those stories, and it's just about trying to figure out who our characters are around them to be able to tell the totality of that story. The reason I put this slide up is also, I always talked about doubling up. So, we'd go into an area, we'd film, because when we were out there, we actually learned that these leopards are probably saving about 100 human lives in India, in Mumbai, downtown Mumbai, because they eat these dogs that are biting people. They bite about 80,000 people every year, and there's about 20 people in Mumbai every year who die from rabies that is spread by stray dogs, and the leopards are actually killing those dogs. So where you can, try and do the science, try and do the photography.
So based on your experience, Alex, how do these communities that live alongside these carnivores, how do they grapple with the tension of a mate be a danger, but also the importance of conserving these animals?
It's a two-edged sword, because I think a lot of communities know that, lions and leopards and elephants, they are the reasons that, a lot of people are coming to national parks. But the trick is, are those communities benefiting? And in a lot of places, they're not, so you have the wildlife authority or the game rangers or, the government authority. But how many people from the local community are actually employed in that park? Or how many are getting like some kind of like tourism operation where they're kind of going from the community, taking people in, and vice versa? The fundamental failure of conservation in the 21st century is of authoritarian institutions coming in and saying, you cannot do X, you cannot do Y, you cannot do Z. When people are living alongside wildlife and they are bearing the brunt of that wildlife through losing their children, losing their livestock, that's the challenge.
Thank you.
Alex,
I'm actually going to jump in real quick, and I apologize because I know that you're going through this, but Lisa actually brought up a really good question a while back. She watched the tree climbing lions, and she said that the outcome really was tragic and kind of stuck with her the entire time, particularly around the constant conflict between animals and people and no boundaries. And even with education, Alex, do you believe that it is possible that there will be a time where there'll be not conflict with people in the villages and with these beautiful animals?
I think there will be when those villages really benefit from those wildlife. And I don't care if that's elephants, I don't care if it's servals or mountain lions, whatever it is. When people, until the day that we can stop, someone, from going hungry, but at the same time, got to be realistic around deeper seated political issues, so if you have cows living next to a national park, I want to know who those cows belong to. Do they belong to the local communities and to the local people that earn maybe $5 a day? Or are they the stock of a wealthy politician that lives 500 kilometers away? Because if they're the latter, then there's a fundamentally much deeper problem, and it's a political issue, and it's no longer a thing of people going hungry, and so yeah, I think if we can make communities benefit, then yes, we will see that day.
Alex, there's another great question from Sherry Jetterberg, a dean at one university. You have some pretty powerful megaphones, and you're very accomplished and talented with National Geographic and some of the other platforms you work in. But how can this story be shared more globally outside of these platforms? She's offering to share this in the state of New Mexico, but what about on a more granular individual level and people participating in this conversation?
It's a very good question, and I think, you'd be surprised as to how receptive a lot of editors will be at smaller, even regional newspapers and wildlife magazines. Most of the stuff that I did before any Nat Geo work that I'd ever done was always done at a local, national level. So I would contact travel magazines, I would contact local wildlife magazines. And you know what, we live in a time now where, there's a fantastic medium called The Conversation, and it's a non-profit media outlet, but basically anyone can write for them, and there's tons like it, where basically if you have a good story, if you have the visuals, if you have the text, you just write the pitch. But I would just say approach regional, national publications and just say, like, here's the outline, here's what I'm thinking, here's some images to get you interested. Have you got a little bit of money to throw at this? If you don't, maybe we can find the money somewhere else, but here's what I'm thinking. Just write as many emails as you can to multiple platforms, and people will come back to you.
Alex, we have pretty much everybody who's listening right now wants to be in your vehicle with you when you're taking these pictures. It must be an amazing, just capturing some of the conversation, it just must be an amazing opportunity to be that close to the animals. But Sarah has a wonderful question. She is a founder of a small NGO that funds big cat conservation projects in South Africa. She kind of wants to know your perspective, pros and cons from conservation programs that are fenced privately fenced reserves in southern Africa.
I think it's a mixed bag. South Africa is so incredibly unique. Living almost my entire adult life there and sort of youth there. I'm very intimately aware with the fact that we have so many fences. So for the viewers and listeners out there, South Africa is incredibly unique because we have big national parks like the Kruger National Park, the Kalahari National Park in the west of the country, incredible protected area landscape, but there are a lot of places where we have small fenced reserves, and the fundamental reason is that it's one of the only countries in the whole of the world where wildlife can actually be privately owned. So I can own 50 impala, I can own 50 lions, and it's the reason why we've gotten ourselves into such a mess where we have essentially small fenced reserves which are using lions as sort of chicken farms, and we are breeding lions and we are selling them and we are hunting them. So I'd say that one of the fundamental ways to tell if a smaller reserve is legit, if you like, is to sort of try and hone in on sort of what specifically they are doing. Have they got an active, predator breeding program? Are they affiliated to trophy hunting schemes? And that gets even more murky, because then that sort of responds to your own value base. Do you see trophy hunting as something that is a sustainable land use form or not? If it isn't, then don't support that particular reserve or entity. But I would just say stay clear of anyone who's breeding big cats, because we know that in South Africa there is a very strong link between any breeding operation, the cub petting trade, and also the trade for body parts of these animals that are sent to the Far East for traditional medicine. That is the fundamental warning that I can say. So in South Africa, if we thought that the Tiger King was bad in America, with the fact that there's more tigers in private operations in America than there are in the wild, the problem fundamentally is even worse in South Africa, because we have more lions in captivity and in these small fenced reserves. So that would be my sort of honest advice. But just try and hone in on whether they have a legitimate tourism operation and conservation.
Well, Alex, you brought up Tiger King, a worldwide phenomenon while we're all in quarantine and isolation. And it really has brought a very big spotlight on zoos and on the lions and the big cats. Chantel asked a wonderful question, knowing that people believe keeping zoos in animals can deprive them from their natural habitat. The question that came up is, what would you say the role of zoos, what is the role of zoos in conservation? Are they helpful? Are they harmful? What are your thoughts?
I'd say fundamentally at its core, you just have to identify sort of the zoo or animal keeping facility. You just got to, before you even look at them, just figure out, are they accredited? Who are they affiliated to? Who gives them money? Basically, like, are they publicly respected by other institutions? For instance, like with Joe Exotic Zoo, that would be they're like the most, underground kind of weird private facility that there is. And, the moment that anybody walked in, they would be like, whoa, what's going on? But a lot of people didn't know that. But so I'd say the first thing is reputation and credibility. Are they sort of working with scientists? Are they, publicly in the spotlight, and are they respected? That's the first thing. The second thing, yes, they are incredibly powerful vehicles for education. Don't forget that a lot of zoos are, away from wild places. Best thing that a lot of places might have in a city is a small park. So zoo is very cool in terms of educating young children, and who knows if they become the next Jane Goodall or not. Maybe a zoo and an encounter with a chimpanzee was the reason that happened. And then 3, they're incredibly important because some zoos are very good in terms of keeping a genetic stud book of how they breed animals. And if animals are either endangered or extinct in the wild, they might be the last sort of seed banks of that genetic material. For instance, in Europe, there's a woman called Sarah Christie, and she actually manages the breeding of various tiger subspecies across the whole European zoo chain. And without that, who knows what happens in 20 years? Maybe there's a big patch of critical potential habitat that opens up and they can reintroduce some subspecies that are critically endangered. So for that reason, those are the sort of 2 reasons: education and genetic sort of stud banks. And then obviously we just have to be careful as to which zoos we get involved and visit.
And so most people have watched The Tiger King. What are your thoughts? It is now come out that many of those animals were killed. They were indecently taken care of. What are your thoughts on? Have you seen that documentary? And then what?
Yeah. I was much like you, Josh. Like, I binge watched that thing.
Don't call me out.
Yeah, I think I watched in like 2 days. So the fundamental sort of issue around, and I think the reason why Netflix went for it, that Netflix probably went for it because it was essentially a soap opera. It had murder mysteries tied in. There was a big love triangle between certain people. There was all these different things, and almost the tigers were almost this kind of like background to the story. And I think that's really why the network went for it, because it was this very interesting story. But what it failed to really portray was just how bad this whole breeding industry was and is. That's a big problem in the US and also in Africa, in South Africa. Brig cats are being bred for not only cub petting. So I would say to anybody, if you are offered the chance at any of these places, whether it's a zoo or private collection, to play or pet a cub, that it's very likely that the life of that animal in the future is going to be in jeopardy, because it's either going to get hunted, it's going to get traded, or even worse, it might get killed, and then its body parts might be exported to the Far East for traditional medicine. Now that is happening in South Africa. 1,600 skeletons are being exported every single year in South Africa. So not only are these cats that are being bred and cub petted being hunted, but they are actually being exported. Their body parts are being used for traditional medicine. So we need to be very, very careful and very cautious of sort of going to these institutions and supporting them, all in the name of a selfie.
So I think, go ahead, Scott. Do you have a question?
Oh, just a follow up. Alex, I kind of maybe asked this before. It's, your PhD, is it the sciences or the arts on these animals?
Oh, it was science based. So it was looking at the conservation status of lions and other carnivores in Uganda, and then also looking at elements of human-wildlife conflict in the same region. So basically,
how did you? It's unusual that you chose a camera as your research tool to keep looking at this, to document, and to talk about this. How? I know you said you studied with a very well-known photographer. I don't know who the person is, but how did that happen? And what would you say to other people listening to this now and in the future about unconventional methods to continue the work you do? Because most people that do a PhD in that program, I imagine, did not pick up a camera to continue the conversation?
I mean, I was very lucky because when I was counting lions as one of my PhD chapters in Uganda, basically trying to figure out in this park how many lions there are, my method involved using a camera to photograph individual lions with whiskers spots. So the whisker patterning on every lion is different. So a camera lends itself to being a good tool for that. And so it was kind of the 2-for-1 that I could shoot the video and the documentaries, and I had a camera that was good, so I could actually freeze frame individual images and then pull them and then identify the cats. But I would just say that well, there's two things. There's a difficulty when you're doing science because you're collecting data and you need to focus on that. So like then taking photos is quite difficult. But what I would say to anybody who's potentially looking at using the arts as a visual medium to communicate their results in their science, which I'm sort of encouraging people to do, is to allocate time, whether that's a week after your project or before your project or in your holidays, to just really go after whatever that is. Because it gives you so much more leverage when you write or publish that scientific paper, finally. And we know how, bluntly, science in that way sucks because it takes so long. I mean, I just got a paper accepted yesterday. It took, 3 years from the time I started the thing to the time it's going to be published this year. 3 years. A video or photographic story in one of these outlets can go like that. We can potentially pitch it and get the thing done in maybe 6 months. So all I'm saying is that to be more attractive to the media at large, it doesn't kill us to spend 3 or 4 days. And I mean, if we're going to really go after a scientific story, maybe it's 4 months, but to really sort of get that more of that 2-for-1. And as I say, it doesn't have to be on lions. It doesn't have to be on these big fancy animals. It can be on, that rare and endangered endemic species of flower that lives in your backyard.
And Alex, we're almost to time. And before I ask you for your concluding thoughts and any closing remarks, are there any misconceptions from these big cats, these carnivores, that you would like to share? I know you're invested in telling their stories, and I know as humans who do not get to be in these spaces where you do this work, are there any stories, any misconceptions that you would like to address that people may have?
I guess the biggest misconception is maybe that they're super aggressive and they're super dangerous and want to kill us and hurt us. That's not the case at all. So actually, the majority of cats that you actually encounter on foot when you're walking in the forest as a person will actually run away from you and will be more scared of you than you are of them. The reason for that is because we've sort of had 3 million years of evolution along that hominid chain that's basically conditioned both of us. But for the cats, it's bipedal ape, stands up tall, forward-facing eyes. I'm scared of this thing. So if you ever do encounter a big cat, the only thing you shouldn't do is run away. So always stand up straight, clap your hands, shout. Most big animals, if they see something fleeting running away, they'll run after it. And then the other misconception maybe is that I think they're in a much more dire situation in terms of their conservation than we really appreciate. And the reason for that is because we are so conditioned to seeing things with big cat imagery every day, whether it's a bottle of tiger beer, whether it's a phone with a tiger emblem on it. That conditions us to think that these things are super common. And in fact, a lot of them are on the verge of local or even total extinction. So those are the two misconceptions that I would say, yeah.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that we get in this last question that just came in. So what role do big corporations play in helping preserve these ecosystems?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, what role do big corporations play in helping preserve these ecosystems? Thank you, Fraser, for that question.
A lot of big corporates do put money out to support some conservation projects, but there's no legal mechanism compels any company to give to any species conservation at present, which I think is an interesting question, because I think that we should. I think that the fact that a lot of companies use big cat imagery or the imagery of elephants to basically bomb us, the public, to sell their products, they should help with their species conservation. Do you not think so? So I think that in some places they do help, but in many places, big corporations, just because of how gigantic they are, do fail, unfortunately, in species conservation. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you, Alex. And so we only have 5 minutes left till 1 p.m. And so to keep us on time, what are your closing remarks? What is a call to action that you have for the viewers now and the viewers who may be seeing this later on?
Sorry, what's that?
What closing remarks do you have, and what is your call to action for any of the viewers that we have today, and also the viewers that may be seeing this later on?
I would say, you know, just the biggest realization would be like, you know, if you really are at that bridging point where you think you might want to chase the visual stuff, now is a good time to do it. You know, there are more paths into these various avenues, these big outlets than ever before. You know, now is really the time to do that. And as I say, just a good brainstorming session of whatever science or whatever topic you're doing, or whatever thing that lives, whether it's an animal or a plant community that lives near your house, you know, just try and brainstorm and think about the problem visually that you want to document in its totality. So again, you know, think about the people that are interested in conserving that thing or managing that thing. And basically just think about the story a little bit more broadly. You know, I think that everyone and anyone can capture them. And, you know, just pick up a lot of good photography magazines. And, you know, a lot of photography taking is to do with geometry and symmetry. And once you get those things and you get your eye conditioned, you can kind of do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. You've really been able to show us some amazing pictures that you have with you, and also brought in a lot of complexity to this issue of animal conservation. So we really want to thank you for that. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today. We welcome you to join us next week. Please tell your friends, join us on social media, on Instagram, TEDxUCLA, also on Facebook, TEDxUCLA. Alex, if you want to go ahead and drop your social media platforms as well in this chat so people can stay engaged with you and the work that you do, please feel free to do so. Next week, we'll be talking with Oliver about, he's a virologist. So there's more information on that on our website. And thank you all for joining in. We will see you next week. Josh and Scott, if you have any final questions or thoughts.
No, just thanks everyone for being part of this. We plan to, we're a little late to the game because, you know, this is all new for us too. We are documenting these talks. We've captured session 1, and we're capturing session 2, and we will post this on the website with the chats to try to keep the conversation going. This is really supposed to spark ideas and then potentially have all kinds of follow-ups. So really appreciate everyone being part of this.
And a super big thanks to Alex. It is 5 o'clock in the morning in Australia, and it is almost 1 o'clock in the morning here. I'm sorry, 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in Los Angeles. We greatly appreciate you joining us so early in the morning. Folks, thank you for joining us, and thank you. Alex, if you don't mind staying on, that would be great.